From the very moment he stepped into that classroom, many had already decided his fate. To them, it was only a matter of time before the boy would make a mistake and expose himself in front of everyone. But what none of them knew was that on that very day, a simple math lecture would turn into something much greater. It wouldn't be just a contest of numbers, but a battle against condescending looks, against prejudice disguised as high standards, against the silent voices, whispering, "You don't belong here." But what really happened when the final challenge was thrown? And why did some of the country's top professors never look at him the same way again? Stay until the end, because this story will reveal something few have the courage to face. If stories of courage and justice inspire you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and get ready for what's coming next. The cold fluorescent lights hummed softly inside the vast lecture hall of the University of Michigan. More than 100 students had taken their seats. The air was filled with the quiet rustling of notebooks opening, the clicks of laptop keyboards, and the occasional nervous whisper. Today wasn't an ordinary day. Unlike regular lectures, this session had drawn more than just students. At the very front row sat several professors from different departments, academic heavyweights, their faces stoic, their gazes sharp. They were not here to learn. They were here to evaluate, to judge, and perhaps to witness a spectacle they secretly expected. Professor Linda Cartwright, known for her ruthless teaching methods, was about to enter. In her world, there was no room for the weak. She didn't believe in nurturing students. She believed in breaking them, separating the so-called gifted from the unworthy, and for some, that unworthy label had already been silently assigned to one student sitting quietly halfway down the middle rows. Daniel Reed. He wore a plain grey hoodie, simple jeans, and sat with his head lowered, fingers lightly spinning a pen between them. His notebook, neatly organized with sharp, precise handwriting, lay open in front of him. But what made Daniel stand out was not his appearance. It was the way people around him looked at him, because for some, it wasn't his talent that they noticed first. It was the color of his skin. In the front row, Professor Whitaker crossed his arms, eyes narrowing slightly as his gaze landed on Daniel. He leaned toward the colleague beside him and whispered, with a dry chuckle, "That one won't last the session, mark my words. He's out of his depth." The professor next to him smiled faintly and nodded. Affirmative action, probably. This field isn't made for people like him. The soft murmurs of agreement rippled among a few others. They weren't discussing mathematics. They weren't concerned about formulas or theorems. They were watching Daniel, waiting for him to fail. Daniel heard nothing, but he had heard it all before. The same whispers, the same assumptions. He had grown used to them. What they didn't know, not yet, was that on this particular day, their carefully built assumptions would be shaken. And by the time the sun set, everything they thought they knew about him would be rewritten. The sharp clicking of high heels suddenly echoed across the cold marble floor. Professor Cartwright had entered the room. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Silence spread like a cold wave. Students froze, heads lowered, keyboards stopped. Nobody dared look up. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, her silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh white light above. Her face expressionless, an image of absolute authority. Her reputation preceded her. Those who made mistakes under her watch never recovered. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to threaten. Her mere presence was enough to drain the air. And from the room, as she scanned the lecture hall, her eyes momentarily paused on Daniel. Her gaze didn't linger long, just long enough to send an unspoken message. "Do you think you belong here?" Her lips remained pressed. No words were needed. With a slight narrowing of her eyes, she moved on, as though dismissing him entirely. Daniel remained still, but deep inside, he recognized the silent challenge. Today would be different. Professor Cartwright turned her back to the class and lifted a piece of chalk. Her movements were sharp, efficient, the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. With swift strokes, she began writing on the board. Last week we covered multivariable limits. Today we move into Laplace transforms. Complex equations flowed across the blackboard, one after another, building into a towering wall of mathematical difficulty. The pace was brutal. The students furiously scribbled in their notebooks, racing. To keep up, some were already lost from the very first line, but no one dared to speak. In Cartwright's class, falling behind was your fault, and raising your hand for help? Unthinkable. In the front row, the visiting professors nodded approvingly. They admired Cartwright not just for her brilliance, but for her mercilessness. To them, a real teacher wasn't one who lifted students up. It was one who weeded out the weak. Only the strongest survived. Daniel, sitting halfway back, moved differently. He wasn't scribbling like the others. His pen barely moved. Instead, his eyes calmly traced the growing web of equations on the board. To him, the symbols weren't a wall to climb. They were patterns to observe. But then, something caught his eye. A tiny inconsistency. A slip in the transformation. At first glance, it was nearly invisible, so subtle that most wouldn't even notice. Certainly none of the other students did. They kept copying blindly, line after line. Daniel's brow furrowed. The mistake wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. But as the equations built, that small deviation would snowball into an entirely incorrect result. Cartwright continued, completely unaware, or so it seemed, of the flaw she had introduced. Daniel glanced around the room. No one else saw it. They never did. He could let it go, ignore it, stay invisible. Speaking up would bring every eye upon him, and not kindly. He knew what it would mean to challenge Cartwright, especially in front of this audience of professors. To them, it wouldn't just be correcting a simple math error. It would be insubordination, arrogance, a black student daring to correct one of the most feared professors in the department. Unthinkable. And yet, letting the mistake slide felt worse, because Daniel despised arrogance. He despised those who assumed they were untouchable, and above all, he despised the quiet cruelty of people who judged others not by skill, but by appearance. His decision was made in seconds. Slowly, he raised his hand. The classroom froze. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Cartwright's chalk stopped in mid-air. She turned her head, her eyes locking onto Daniel. Her expression didn't change, but her lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. The room held its breath. "Yes?" she asked, voice perfectly calm, but laced with something far colder. Daniel's voice was steady. "There's a mistake in the transformation step, Professor." The silence thickened like fog. You could feel the professors leaning forward slightly in their seats. Whitaker, arms crossed, smiled faintly, as if already savoring the moment he believed was coming. One of his colleagues whispered with a smirk, "Well, he just dug his own grave." Cartwright, still expressionless, tilted her head. "A mistake?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "The coefficient was introduced too early. It'll corrupt the final solution." The smallest flicker crossed her face, so brief only the sharpest observer would have caught it, but she recovered instantly, her voice calm, dangerously soft. "Are you sure?" she asked again. Her tone was not a question, it was a warning. Daniel did not blink. "Yes, I'm sure." In the front row, the professors exchanged knowing glances. Whitaker's smirk deepened. To them, this was entertainment. Student daring to challenge Cartwright never ended well, but Daniel remained standing, unwavering. The moment had arrived, and what no one in that room yet realized was that this was only the first crack. The wall was about to crumble. Without breaking eye contact, Cartwright slowly extended her hand, offering Daniel the chalk. "Since you're so confident, Mr. Reed, come, show us." The tension in the room thickened. Students exchanged glances. Some whispered, others smirked. They had seen this happen before. Cartwright wasn't just inviting Daniel to correct her, she was laying a trap. The other professors leaned forward in their seats, clearly intrigued. This was no longer a lecture, it was a public spectacle. "Professor," Whitaker whispered to the colleague next to him, "look at him walking into it. He won't last 2 lines." Daniel stood up. His movements were steady, unhurried. He took the chalk from Cartwright's hand, feeling the weight of 100 eyes bearing down on him. He could hear the low murmurs behind his back. The professors, who had questioned his place here, were waiting for him to crumble. But Daniel wasn't nervous. In fact, the moment he touched the board, his world became strangely quiet. The numbers were all that existed now. He wiped a small portion of the board, clean, and began. His first stroke was deliberate, then the next. The equations flowed from him not like guesses, but like truths already written in his mind. The error was precisely where he said it would be. He corrected it seamlessly, realigning the transformation steps with mathematical grace. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The whispers behind him faded. Even the visiting professors, eager to see him fail, found themselves squinting at the board. One student blinked, then leaned toward her classmate and whispered, "Wait, he's actually fixing it," Daniel continued, building upon the correction, rebalancing the entire equation to its rightful form. Every step tightened the noose on Cartwright's error. She stood beside him, arms crossed, her lips thin, her face expressionless. But her eyes revealed the truth. She hadn't expected him to actually be right. As Daniel finished, he calmly returned the chalk to the tray. He didn't look at anyone. He simply took a quiet step back. The room was dead silent. No one dared move. The visiting professors scanned the board. Even Whitaker leaned forward, his smug smile now flickering. With uncertainty, every line was correct, perfectly correct. Cartwright's gaze remained fixed on the board for several long seconds. She was searching desperately for anything to dispute, but there was nothing. The mistake was hers. The correction was his. Finally she spoke, her voice flat, dry. "Good." A simple word, void of praise, void of grace, but heavy with unspoken frustration. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. The entire room had just witnessed what happened, and yet Cartwright wasn't done. Her pride wouldn't allow her to stop here. With the faintest hint of a smile returning to her face, she turned back to the board and began writing again. Faster now, the symbols growing more complex. The problem she constructed this time was monstrous, a labyrinth of non-linear transformations, nested integrals, and higher-order functions. The students stiffened. This wasn't a test anymore, it was a declaration of war. When she finished, she turned toward Daniel once more. "If you're as capable as you believe, Mr. Reed, then solve this!" The room erupted into soft gasps and nervous whispers. The trap had only just begun. Daniel stood motionless for a brief moment, eyes scanning the monstrous equation. Sprawling across the board, every student, every professor, every skeptical gaze locked onto him. Now, they thought. Now he'll falter. Even Cartwright's posture shifted ever so slightly. Her arms folded tighter across her chest, her chin raised just enough to signal silent dominance. This was no longer a simple test. This was designed to crush him. Graduate level. Complexity. Nested functions. Non-linear systems, multivariable integrals stacked one on top of the other, equations that even seasoned doctoral students would spend hours trying to untangle. One of the guest professors whispered, "She's daring him to drown." Whitaker smirked, eyes cold. "And he will." But Daniel's face remained unreadable. He wasn't overwhelmed. He wasn't panicking. He was calculating silently. Then, without a word, he stepped forward, lifted the chalk, and made his first mark. The classroom inhaled collectively, as if bracing for impact. His hand moved smoothly, like an artist who had studied every brushstroke before placing it on the canvas. There were no pauses, no double checks, no erasures. Each transformation unfolded with surgical precision. His approach was unorthodox, bold, attacking the problem. From an angle none of the professors had anticipated. Even the students who had dismissed him minutes ago now leaned forward, watching in disbelief. "Is he, simplifying it?" one student whispered. Daniel was doing more than solving. He was rebuilding the problem. Step by step, he disassembled the layers, peeled back the complexity, and exposed the elegant truth hidden beneath. Cartwright's expression shifted again, just briefly, but enough for those watching closely to sense something dangerous. Unease. Whitaker's tapping fingers slowed. The visiting professors leaned toward each other, murmuring in low tones. "This is different." Minutes passed. The room held its breath. Every symbol Daniel wrote was deliberate, refined, not one wasted line. Students glanced at their own notebooks, trying desperately to follow his logic, but falling behind instantly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel laid the chalk gently back into the tray. The equations stood before them. Solved. Completely. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of absolute disbelief. Even those who had once whispered, who had once doubted him, now stared at the board, at Daniel, as though witnessing something beyond comprehension. Whitaker's face hardened. Cartwright's jaw tightened. There was no mistake to point at, no gap to exploit. Daniel calmly returned to his seat. Still no smile, still no words. His silence was louder than any applause. The students, one by one, turned their heads toward Cartwright, waiting, almost daring her to respond. And for a long moment, she didn't, because for the first time in her career, there was nothing left to say. The moment Daniel returned to his seat, the room remained locked in breathless silence. Some students began exchanging glances, not with pity, not with skepticism, but with something far more dangerous to Cartwright: admiration. For the first time, the hierarchy she had so carefully cultivated was beginning to crack. She straightened her back, hiding the tremor of her fingers beneath the lectern. Her gaze shifted quickly to the visiting professors sitting in the front row. She could sense their eyes narrowing, not toward Daniel anymore, but toward her. Whitaker, sitting rigid, refused to meet anyone's gaze. He was calculating, not math this time, but damage control, and Cartwright knew it. "If I lose control now, I lose them all." She forced a faint smile, stepping forward again with a calmness that was more rehearsed than real. "Impressive," she said softly. "Very impressive." The room waited. They knew that tone. It was not a concession. It was a setup. She turned to the judges' table, where the other professors had gathered to observe. "But true mastery," she continued, "is not proven by solving isolated problems. It's tested under pressure, against the best." Her voice cut through the air like a thin blade. The students held their breath. Daniel watched her carefully, unmoved. She reached into her briefcase, pulling out a folder thicker than any textbook she had used in class. "The National Mathematics Championship will be held in 4 weeks, she announced, letting the weight of her words settle into every corner of the auditorium. "It is not for undergraduates. It is not even for most graduates. Only the most elite minds in the country will compete." Gasps whispered across the room. The stakes had just multiplied. Daniel sat still, his face unreadable. "You say you belong here, Mr. Reed. Prove it, not to me, but to the nation." The professors behind her nodded, some with intrigue, others with hunger. This wasn't just another problem. This was the ultimate battlefield. compete against PhDs, postdoctoral fellows, and professional mathematicians, under a ticking clock, under public scrutiny with everything on the line. Cartwright's trap was clear. If he declined, she would dismiss him as scared. If he accepted and failed, she would destroy him. The auditorium held its collective breath, eyes fixed on Daniel. And then, without a second of hesitation, without even glancing away from Cartwright, Daniel simply said, "I accept." The words echoed through the vast hall like a silent bomb. Several students gasped, others whispered nervously. Whitaker's jaw tightened visibly. Cartwright blinked once, just once, her polished armor cracking ever so slightly. He didn't even hesitate. For the first time, she wondered if she had just made her most dangerous mistake. Daniel sat back, his hands calmly resting on his desk, eyes locked with hers. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't impulsive, he was ready. The game had changed, and this time it was no longer hers to control. The moment Daniel left the lecture hall that day, whispers followed him like shadows. In the cafeteria, in the library, even in the dormitories, everyone had one name on their lips: Daniel Reed. Some called him insane, others bold, most simply curious, because no one, not even the brightest students at Michigan, dared to enter the National Mathematics Championship as a mere undergraduate. Not against the best doctoral minds from MIT, Stanford, Caltech, Harvard, men and women who had lived and breathed advanced mathematics since childhood. But Daniel had accepted, and now the countdown had begun. 4 weeks, 28 days, 672 hours. Every moment mattered, while others talked, speculated, and gossiped. Daniel disappeared into the one place he always found peace: the numbers. Each morning before sunrise, he was already seated at his corner in the library. Stacks of advanced textbooks surrounded him, dense volumes of nonlinear systems, topology, functional analysis, abstract algebra, papers from international math olympiads, doctoral dissertations, even unpublished problem sets, passed only among elite scholars. The challenges Cartwright had thrown at him were nothing compared to what he now devoured willingly. But this wasn't mechanical study. Daniel wasn't simply memorizing formulas or rehearsing solutions. He was training his mind to think differently. Every problem was broken apart, reverse-engineered, simplified, reassembled. He didn't just seek answers. He sought the essence behind every equation. He trained not for knowledge, but for clarity, for speed, for precision, for war. And when most students were asleep, Daniel was still there, under flickering fluorescent lights, challenging himself to find 3 solutions for every problem. One for correctness, one for speed, one for elegance. By his side, one person stood quietly through it all: Brian, his only real friend. Night after night, Brian watched the transformation unfold, from brilliance into something even he struggled to comprehend. "You're not human anymore, man. You realize who you'll be facing, right? Some of these guys have professors coaching them, private mentors. You've got no one but you." Daniel paused, pen still moving, eyes fixed on his work, his voice steady. "Good." "Good?" Brian blinked. "Because I don't need anyone. Because they'll make mistakes. I won't." His voice wasn't cocky. It was terrifyingly calm. Brian shook his head in disbelief, but deep down, he started to believe too. Meanwhile, across campus, Cartwright watched from a distance. At first, she was certain the pressure would break him, but the more she observed, the more uneasy she became. Daniel wasn't crumbling, he was growing, so she tried again. Anonymously, she sent him additional problem sets, far more advanced than even the national competition would offer, a silent attempt to overwhelm him, to rattle him. Daniel solved every single one, and then went further. He didn't stop once. He turned the library into his second home, He practiced under timers. He replicated exam conditions. He analyzed past champions' solutions, studying their thought patterns like chess grandmasters, studying opponents' opening moves. And as the days dwindled, even those who once laughed began to fall silent. Word of Daniel's preparation spread to faculty lounges, rival departments, and eventually even to professors from other universities. The murmurs were no longer dismissive, they were worried. By the final week, Cartwright's confidence had cracked. Whitaker, once smug, now watched Daniel with thinly veiled unease. For all their experience, they hadn't seen this before. A student who refused to collapse, a student who refused to break, a student who, somehow, just might pull off the impossible. The countdown reached its final day, and as Daniel closed his final practice notebook, neatly stacked his papers, and stood from his chair, he glanced briefly at Brian. No words were needed. The battle was no longer ahead. It had already begun. The sun had barely risen over the towering skyline of Philadelphia, but inside the grand auditorium of the University of Pennsylvania, the air was already electric. Rows upon rows of heavy wooden desks filled the hall, each assigned to a competitor. Each competitor carefully selected from the brightest mathematical minds across the country: MIT, Stanford, Harvard, Caltech, Princeton. They were all here, geniuses, armed not with weapons, but with minds sharpened like blades, honed through years of elite coaching, private mentorships, and endless preparation. And then there was Daniel. He walked in alone. No cheering squad, no professors shaking his hand, no advisors whispering last-minute strategies. Only Brian stood in the far back corner, nervously clutching his coffee cup, unable to hide the tension in his eyes. All eyes turned toward Daniel as he made his way to his seat. Some glanced out of curiosity, some with amusement, and many with open contempt. To them, Daniel was a curiosity, a statistical anomaly, a spectacle they expected to burn out before the first hour was over. Whitaker was there too. Front row, alongside Cartwright and a panel of judges, professors from the most prestigious institutions. Cartwright watched Daniel closely, her cold gaze as sharp as ever. But beneath her stoic expression was something she hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. The head judge stepped forward to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Mathematics Championship!" The room went still. The large digital screen behind the stage flickered to life, revealing the first set of problems. Within seconds, an overwhelming wave of complex mathematical symbols filled the screen. Nested integrals, multidimensional Laplace transformations, nonlinear systems, abstract algebraic functions, each problem designed not just to test knowledge, but to crush time, focus, and mental endurance. For most, these were monsters. For Daniel, they were familiar terrain. He picked up his pen, breathed, and began. There was no hesitation, no rereading of the problem, no scribbling or crossing out. The pen glided effortlessly as if transcribing something already solved inside his mind. Around him others slowed quickly, some froze, some furrowed their brows, double-checking their calculations, erasing furiously. Daniel never erased once. As problem after problem appeared, the field began to thin. 1 hour passed, then 2. By the midpoint, dozens had already surrendered. Only a few elite competitors remained, among them an MIT doctoral candidate who, until this day, was considered untouchable. Cartwright's attention shifted between the MIT candidate and Daniel. The MIT student was brilliant, fast, precise. But Daniel was something else entirely. It wasn't speed alone. It was clarity. He wasn't racing the clock. He was dismantling the problems as if he had written them himself. The judges, watching closely, exchanged glances filled with growing astonishment. By the time the penultimate round appeared, Only two contestants were left writing, Daniel Reed and the MIT PhD. And then came the final problem. The problem no one was supposed to solve. The problem meant to break even the best. The screen lit up with a monstrous non-linear differential equation. A maze of nested variables and transformations so complex that even professors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The MIT candidate paused, his pen hovering, calculating multiple approaches. Daniel. He barely blinked. His eyes scanned the problem once, twice, and then his pen moved, deliberate, precise, effortless. This wasn't solving. This was dismantling. In mere minutes, while others still struggled to find a foothold, Daniel reached the solution. He set his pen down, crossed his arms, and calmly leaned back. The MIT candidate was still writing furiously, oblivious to what had just occurred. Even the judges, hardened veterans of decades of competitions, leaned in, stunned. One of them rose quietly, walked over, and reviewed Daniel's solution. He read, he paused, and his eyes widened. Not only was Daniel correct, but his approach was entirely different from the one expected. Cleaner, shorter, more elegant. The judge looked back at the others, then turned. Toward the silent auditorium, his voice echoed through the hall. "We have a winner." The room exploded. A wave of applause erupted, mixed with gasps of disbelief. Competitors turned their heads. Professors whispered in shock. Daniel remained still, silent, because for him, the real victory wasn't the applause. It was the silence of those who once believed he didn't belong here. Cartwright lowered her gaze. Whitaker clenched his fists but found no words, because now there was nothing left to say. Daniel Reed had not just won the competition. He had shattered their system. The next morning, the sun rose quietly over the University of Michigan, but inside Cartwright's advanced calculus lecture hall, there was nothing quiet about the energy in the room. Students whispered, glanced at each other, exchanging looks they didn't dare share only days ago. The heavy door creaked open. Cartwright entered. Her heels echoed on the polished floor, just as they always had. Her posture was straight, her face controlled, but today something was different. Behind the calm mask, something inside her had shifted, something even she could no longer deny. Her eyes swept the room, and then landed on him. Daniel Reed sat exactly where he always sat, middle row, hoodie on, notebook open, pen in hand. But now, every gaze in the room carried a weight of respect that hadn't existed before. He wasn't invisible anymore. No longer the student who probably wouldn't last. No longer the one who somehow got in. Now, he was the champion, the one who had defeated the brightest minds from MIT, Stanford, Princeton, the one who had silenced an entire auditorium of doubters. Cartwright paused briefly. She opened her textbook, turned a few pages, then finally spoke. "Before we begin today's lecture, I have one thing to say." The room went still. Every student stopped moving. Every whisper died. Daniel Reed has proven something far greater than mathematics. That real talent has no skin color. A simple sentence, no embellishment, no elaborate apology, no grand speech. But for this room, for these students, it was a seismic shift. Many glanced toward Daniel as if waiting for a reaction, but Daniel simply nodded slightly, calm, steady, unaffected, because he didn't need Cartwright's words. He didn't need the applause or the belated recognition. He had already won, long before anyone said it aloud. The numbers had spoken, the math had spoken, and in that language there was no room for prejudice, assumption, or bias. Only truth. Cartwright turned back toward the board, picked up the chalk, and resumed her lecture. But everyone in that room knew this was not the same class anymore. Daniel continued taking notes quietly, as if nothing had happened. but the world around him had changed forever. And yet, this wasn't just Daniel's story. This was a story about all those who've been told, "You don't belong here." A story about barriers built by people too afraid to admit their own limits, and a reminder that talent, determination, and truth, when combined, can dismantle even the strongest walls. If you've ever felt judged, underestimated, or told you couldn't succeed, let Daniel's story remind you your value is not defined by anyone else. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more powerful, true stories. Because this is only the beginning.